Alright guys, it's hard to believe it, but we are already starting period 3 now. Period 3 is the first of kind of the real core units of this class. For period 1 and 2 were relatively brief. 3 through 8 are, again, the real meat of what we're going to cover this year as far as content. And if you look at the period 3 years here, we'll notice that it begins in 1754, which happens to be the same year this right here starts, and we're going to end with the year 1800, which is basically after America had been established, and we've got the Constitution, and kind of like as we begin the new republic. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and clearly the American Revolution is the big topic that we need to get to in this unit. Before we get to that, though, we have to set the stage for it. And the 7 Years' War, or the French Indian War, as we call it, is definitely play a big role in creating the revolution. So let's jump into some of the topics and figure out what's going on here. So again, causes and effects of the French Indian War. That's going to be our guiding question. What caused it? What effect did it have? And you can see it here on our list of different wars. Now, don't be confused by the dates here. How they're different. This is the war in America actually lasted longer than the war back home in the European theater. All right, so let's do some causes here of the French and Indian War, and we first have to kind of set the stage here. We've got this colonial rivalry going on between Britain on the coast. There's us. And the French through, they called New France, we would call Canada, and also the Louisiana territory here. So by mid-1700s, the two areas were rubbing up against one another, and that's going to lead to some tension, some friction between the two powers. In particular, the British colonies always had a much larger population than New France ever did, and so there's always a greater demand for sort of elbow room to kind of break out and start to settle. And that's a problem because as British settlers began moving west over the Appalachian Mountains, you run into a problem of overlapping claims. So the British claimed all this through here, so did the French. And what we call the Ohio Valley, it's a reference to the Ohio River, of course, is going to be the flashpoint of all this. Now, the reason the French were so ticked off about this is if the English were to expand really far inland, it would threaten French trade routes, and it would threaten their ability to get to the Native Americans and trade with them. The Native Americans themselves are also upset about this, particularly, obviously, the ones that are allied with the French. They don't like the idea of the British coming in and weakening their autonomy. As I mentioned a moment ago, the Ohio Valley is going to be the chief source of tension. This is going to be the big thorn in the side. And we've addressed this a little bit as to why the French would want this. It's about trade routes and so forth. But it's also geographic. If the British were able to kind of branch out over here, it would really cut a lot of the French access between Louisiana and New France. They would find themselves kind of cut off. Their two colonies would be basically, it wouldn't be linked any longer. So the French really believe they have to hold on to this territory. And in 1749, some British land speculators, and a land speculator is just someone who buys land to resell it for a profit later as an investment. These British land investors or speculators had basically made a claim to about 500,000 acres, all of this territory here, the Ohio Company. And the French were furious about this. Like, you can't sell this land, it's our land. And the French were, in fact, busy building forts in this territory. You can see Fort Duquesne, for example. Fort Duquesne is where modern-day Pittsburgh is located. All right, now, I don't know if you know this, but you probably learned it actually in 8th grade. A famous American, or at least someone who will be famous a little bit later than this event, he was sent out to investigate French activities. He was serving the British at this time period, and his soldiers are going to fight the very first battle of this war. And that person is none other than George Washington. So future president, future founding father, George Washington was a lieutenant colonel in the British militia at the time, Virginia militia anyways, and his soldiers basically kind of ran into some French soldiers out in the woods. There was a pitched battle in which his soldiers were forced to retreat, and they built what they called Fort Necessity, which I got to say is a very sad-looking fort. The Fort Necessity was eventually surrendered. So George Washington's military career did not get off to a very auspicious start. All right, so the first shots have been fired. What happens in the course of the war? In the early days of the war, things do not go well for the British. We talked about how Washington was defeated down here at Fort Necessity. About a year later, another British expedition was launched into the Ohio Territory, led by a general named Braddock, British general named Braddock, and it was an absolute rout. They were ambushed by the Indians and the French. Braddock himself was killed, and his force destroyed. About 1,000 British soldiers were either killed or wounded in this disaster. So the French are looking pretty confident. The British are now going 0 for 2 in this war. In the end, however, the French really are not going to be able to win this war. And the major reason is New France, or Canada, had always been so sparsely populated. There were only a handful of major settlements, and the British had so many more people that they can draw on. Plus, the French Navy was inferior compared to the British Navy, so resupplying New France was always a challenge. And by 1759, 5 years into the war, Quebec, the very first settlement in all of New France, was captured by the British. A year later, they march up the St. Lawrence River and take Montreal. And once the two big cities of New France were taken, it really kind of spells doom for the French war effort. So now that the war is winding down, it's time to look at the effects. So this war, the French-Indian War, ends like a lot of wars in European history with a Treaty of Paris. There's been quite a few of those treaties. This is the 1763 variety, and the details, well, France, they're going to lose big time. They're really going to be taken to the cleaners by the British. They're going to lose Canada, that is to say New France, the whole Louisiana territory. They're going to have to give to their ally Spain, because as kind of a reward for Spain helping them in this unsuccessful war. Spain, being on the losing side, they're going to have to give over Florida to Britain. And so the big consequence, if you take all that together, what we come out of this war with is Britain as the unquestioned leader of North America. So before this, Spain, France, and Britain had been competing for North America. Britain may have had an advantage, but there was still competition. Now Britain has won. There's no competition left to speak of. So that's the map. We've got, again, pre-war, French down the middle, British claims over here, Spanish claims over here, and then after the war, the British reign supreme over North America. Now, Britain may have come out on the winning side, but the war came with tremendous costs, and literally costs in terms of money. Wars are, of course, very, very expensive, and the British national debt went way up. So there's the 7 Years' War. That's the French-Indian War. Notice how their British debt was actually going down before the war, and then it just takes off like a rocket. And so this is going to set the stage for taxes from the British to pay down that debt. And of course, the taxes will lead into the American Revolution. All right, speaking of the American colonists, because we really haven't talked that much about them right now, what were they doing during this revolution, or excuse me, during this war against the French? And the answer is, well, lots of stuff. Life went on as normal for most American colonists. Many American colonists fought for the British, in this war, so they're getting wartime experience they can later apply during the Revolution. And they're also thinking about kind of working more closely together. And this brings us to the Albany Congress. The Albany Congress is seen as kind of the first big intercolonial get-together. 7 of the 13 colonies are going to send representatives. They're going to meet in Albany, which is in upstate New York. That's the modern-day capital of New York State. And this meeting's got a couple different goals. Number one, the first goal was to keep the Iroquois, which is a group of Native Americans in upstate New York, loyal to the British. They were fearful that the Iroquois might jump ship and join with the French, which would weaken the British war effort tremendously. So again, the short term, they were just trying to kind of keep that arrangement together. But long term, why we're really looking at this is this idea that's starting to kind of take hold in some colonists' mind, that maybe these individual colonies are not that different from one another, that they're not destined to be separate from one another, that maybe they should be working in much closer unity. And you know, if they join together, they can better defend themselves against the French, and they can also just have more leverage in the future over the British. And so that's, again, the long-term effect of this is this idea of getting these colonies not separated, but starting to kind of think of them as one solid unit, as one group of Americans. The leading spirit of this Congress was Benjamin Franklin, one of the most famous Americans of all time, certainly the most famous American of his time. And he also came up with this thing called the Albany Plan, which was obviously part of the Albany Congress. And the plan was a proposal for home rule. And home rule means self-rule. This was a plan that, if it had been implemented, the British would still rule over the 13 colonies, but they would do so with very loose reins. They would let the Americans rule their own affairs in kind of a day-to-day fashion. This plan is never enacted for two reasons. The British felt it gave too much power to the American colonists, and a lot of American colonists believed it didn't give enough power to them and too much to the British. So it just didn't satisfy enough people. But it does speak to this idea of the Americans operating by themselves without the constant oversight of the British. All right, as the French and Indian War comes to an end, a group of Native Americans led by a chief named Pontiac is going to rise up in rebellion against British control, particularly over the Ohio Valley area that the British had just gained from the French. It's a very bloody, long rebellion. It's one where the British really are kind of pushed to the limits by the Native American uprising. All told, about 2,000 settlers and soldiers will die in this widespread rebellion. You can see attacks by Indians all over the place. All these isolated British settlements, many of them were laid siege to, or at least raided, and it was a very scary situation for the British. Eventually, the rebellion does fizzle out, and the British are able to maintain control over the Ohio Valley, but the British had learned a valuable and very violent lesson that you can only push the Native Americans so far, and it's the encroachment of settlers onto the land that was ticking the Indians off the most. So, if you're Britain and you want to discourage Americans from settling west of the Appalachians on Native American land, how can you do that? Well, the British decided to simply draw a line. They called it the Proclamation line. The Proclamation of 1763. And the British said, Americans, you cannot settle past this line. And their goal was to kind of ease tensions to where the Native Americans would settle down and another big Pontiac-style rebellion would not happen. But that's assuming Americans listen to the British and are willing to just stay right here on the right side of this line. American colonists, by and large, were not happy about this. They were angered. They felt that they had contributed to victory against the French, and therefore they deserve this land. They saw it as their birthright, as their destiny. And when the British closed the door on it, the Americans are mad, and they just basically, if the door is closed, they're going to go through the window or something, because a lot of Americans decided to defy this law, and the British can't be everywhere at once. And so Americans start to illegally settle west of that line. So, causes and effects of the French and Indian War. We looked at them. We looked at the land dispute over the Ohio Valley between the French and the British. We looked at the course of the war. The British got off to a rocky start, but they eventually won after taking Quebec and Montreal. And then we looked at some of the effects of the Treaty of Paris, where the French had to give up New France, and they had to turn over Louisiana to the Spanish. The Spanish had to give up Florida to the British, and the British reigned supreme over North America. We also looked briefly at the Pontiac Rebellion, where the Indians rose up, and the British decided to not let Americans settle west of the Appalachians any longer. So that's it for topic 3.2, guys.